On May 28, 2025, a planned directive from the Bishop of Charlotte, Michael Martin, was leaked to the press. In this document, Bishop Martin makes the statement that, quote, "The Church does not call for the Latin language to be used widely in the liturgy," end quote. Included in this statement from Bishop Martin is not merely a rejection of the 1962 Missal, but also a firm rejection of the Latin celebration of the Novus Ordo Missae, or even the inclusion of certain parts of the Mass in Latin during the vernacular celebration of the Novus Ordo. Unfortunately, it is this type of understanding of the contemporary magisterium of the Church that is common in the mind of Catholics. But is this a correct understanding? Fortunately, it is not anywhere near being accurate. From the time of the Second Vatican Council, Pope after Pope has encouraged the use of Latin within the liturgy. In this video, I want to give a complete overview of all of these documents, including the special norms that are given by the USCCB in favor of the use of Latin in the Mass, and some considerations of the practical pastoral directives that have been recommended, along with certain canonical considerations. Here we will see that there is not only a mere right to the use of Latin, which is given in law, but also an active encouragement at every level that Latin be commonly and frequently used in the Mass, and that every Catholic be catechized in such a way to actively participate in a Mass where there is Latin. This active encouragement is given at every level of the hierarchy, from our Episcopal Conference to the popes following the Second Vatican Council to the Vatican Council itself. To be clear, while it is clearly against the manifest will and pastoral guidance of the successors of St. Peter for clerics to ardently oppose the use of Latin in the liturgy, this is not the only problem. Another clear problem, where bishops and pastors are failing in their duties, is by not heeding the call to actively inculcate the use and familiarity of Latin among Latin Rite Catholics. This is a duty imposed upon pastors zealously by our shepherds, an imposition that has been largely ignored. Thus, there is not only a negative command given, but also positive guidance given, which any lover of the Apostolic See is bound to follow to the best of their abilities. But to begin, we must start with the Second Vatican Council, which will set both the legislative and pastoral framework for our discussion. The discussions around Latin in the liturgy began early in the deliberations of the Council Fathers in the first sessions in October of 1962. This had just come off the heels of St. John XXIII's Apostolic Constitution Veterum Sapientia in February of that same year, which is meant to encourage the preservation of the Latin language. Here, the discussions around Latin in the liturgy were not discussions about whether or not there should be Latin in the liturgy. Rather, it was about whether or not there should be concessions to the vernacular in the liturgy. These are two separate questions, as we will see, and is vital for understanding the teaching and law of the Church on this matter. In these debates, which can be read in the Acta of the Council, there arose two groups among the Council Fathers. One group, represented by figures like Cardinal Bacchi, Archbishop Peruzzo, Cardinal Ottaviani, Cardinal McIntyre, and Cardinal Godfrey, thought that there should not be an introduction of the vernacular into the liturgy, due to the many problems that they perceived would come with it. A second group advocated for vernacular translations of certain parts of the Mass to be allowed. Ultimately, after hundreds of written testimonies and many interventions from eminent Council Fathers, the Fathers came to a broad agreement, and the document Sacrosanctum Concilium was overwhelmingly approved. The reason I brought up the debates previous to the approval of the document is so that we understand the context and purpose of the document in relation to the Latin language. The document wasn't over whether the Mass ought to be in Latin or not. Rather, the relevant sections are over whether and how there may be permissions for the Mass to be in the vernacular. This makes much more sense out of the text of the decree, which is permissive in tone. Thus, in number 36, it states, quote, "Particular law remaining in force, the use of the Latin language is to be preserved in the Latin rites. But since the use of the mother tongue frequently may be of great advantage to the people, the limits of its employment may be extended. This will apply, in the first place, to the readings and directives, and to some of the prayers and chants. It is for the competent territorial ecclesiastical authority to decide whether and to what extent the vernacular language is to be used. Their decrees are to be approved, that is, confirmed by the Apostolic See." End quote. I want you to notice something about what is said. This document isn't about whether there will be Latin or not. It is stated from the beginning that Latin is approved, as we will see in the Code of Canon Law. Rather, it is about whether there can be an additional permission of the use of the vernacular in some parts of the liturgy given by episcopal conferences. The Latin liturgy is already approved as the typical form given by the Apostolic See to the Latin Rite of the Church. Episcopal conferences aren't told to decide whether there will be Latin or not in their areas. This is something that they do not have the authority to determine. Rather, the Church has granted permissions for these episcopal conferences to decide whether, alongside Latin, the vernacular will also be allowed in their areas. This point is actually clearly brought forward by Pope Francis when he revisited this legislation and called it a, quote, partial loss of the Latin language, end quote, and described the relationship of the vernacular to Latin as, quote, the voice of the Church celebrating the divine mysteries along with the Latin language, end quote. Notice it is not in replacement of the Latin language, but along with the Latin language, and it is not a complete loss of the Latin language, but a partial loss of the Latin language. Later, in number 54, we see the same exact thing. The document states, quote, in masses which are celebrated with the people, a suitable place may be allotted to their mother tongue. This is to apply, in the first place, to the readings and the common prayer, but also, as local conditions may warrant, to those parts which pertain to the people. Nevertheless, steps should be taken so that the faithful may also be able to say or to sing together in Latin those parts of the ordinary of the Mass which pertain to them, and wherever a more extended use of the mother tongue within the Mass appears desirable, end quote. Notice it is not saying Latin is now being changed. It is saying that the Council gives a permission for episcopal conferences to introduce the vernacular. The universal permission and normativity of Latin is already assumed. In fact, we see it explicitly encouraged for many parts of the Mass. In fact, the Council orders pastors of souls that, quote, steps should be taken so that the faithful may also be able to say or to sing together in Latin those parts of the ordinary of the Mass which pertain to them, end quote. How many times do we see this directive completely ignored? In fact, this is something that Bishop Martin spoke harshly against. About this text, it is important to note that this is a positive prescription. The Council orders that Latin be retained. This is a command and not merely a recommendation. As the canonist George May notes, quote, this sentence has imposed a command to preserve the Latin language. It must be observed that the official text of the document employs the subjunctive servitor and therefore expresses a command and not merely a recommendation. The Latin language must be preserved. The word usus clearly commands the actual employment of the Latin language and not simply a possibility of its being used. The use of the vernacular is allowed in the liturgy in addition to Latin. The primacy of the Latin may not be assaulted in the process. The use of the vernacular is not simply prescribed, nor is it urgently recommended. It is simply permitted. Therefore, the command to preserve the use of Latin stands in clear contrast to the permission to use the vernacular. The priority of Latin is unequivocally maintained. The Constitution gives examples indicating in which sections the liturgy especially, and therefore not exclusively, the use of the vernacular is of value: lessons, admonitions, many but not all orations, and chants. By giving these examples, the Council has made clear that it is not its intention to allow an exclusive use of the vernacular in the liturgy, end quote. Beside the use of Latin in the Mass, this normative approach is also given for the breviary, where it states, quote, in accordance with the centuries-old tradition of the Latin Rite, the Latin language is to be retained by clerics in the divine office, but in individual cases, the ordinary has the power of granting the use of a vernacular translation for those clerics for whom the use of Latin constitutes a grave obstacle to their praying the divine office properly, end quote. Immediately, this concession by the Council required interpretation and implementation. Thus, St. Paul VI issued a motu proprio called Sacram Liturgiam, which established a commission for implementing the reform of the liturgy. Later that year, a document was issued by the Sacred Congregation of Rites in September of 1964, called Inter Oecumenici. Here we see the same type of emphasis. For example, in number 48, it states, quote, in recited masses, the congregation may recite the Lord's Prayer in the vernacular, along with the celebrant. In sung masses, the people may sing it in Latin along with the celebrant, and, should the territorial ecclesiastical authority have so decreed, also in the vernacular, using melodies approved by the same authority, end quote. Further, in number 57, it lists a limited number of places where the vernacular can be used, such as the lessons, and then goes on to state, quote, Missals to be used in the liturgy, however, shall contain beside the vernacular version the Latin text as well." End quote. Beside this, it gives pastoral guidance to priests, saying, quote, "Pastors should carefully see to it that the Christian faithful, especially members of lay religious institutes, also know how to recite or sing together in Latin, mainly the simple melodies, the parts of the ordinary, the Mass proper to them." End quote. This is a common statement that we will see pervade the magisterial documents on this point. The same points are made about the breviary as mentioned above. In December the next year, there was an instruction given called In Edicendis Normis from the Sacred Congregation of Rites that further expounded upon this teaching. Thus, for example, in interpreting the Council's permission of vernacular for the divine office, it states, quote, "In issuing norms concerning the language to be used in the celebration of the divine office, whether in choir, in common, or individually, the Second Vatican Ecumenical Council had in view both the safeguarding of the centuries-old tradition of the Latin Church and the promotion of the spiritual good of all those who are deputed to or participate in this form of prayer. For this reason, it judged opportune to allow, in certain specific circumstances and for clearly defined categories of persons, the use of the vernacular." End quote. In its various different norms outlined in the document, it is clear that the intent of the Council was one of permission, as we saw above in so many other documents. Finally, in order to set forward the regulations more precisely, with the experience from the Concilium to this point, there was a second document issued named Musicam Sacram in 1967 that is often attached to the Second Vatican Council. This document continues the same line as before, stating as to the breviary, quote, "In accordance with the norms of the Constitution on the liturgy and the centuries-old tradition of the Latin Rite, the Latin language is to be retained for clerics celebrating the divine office and choir. However, the same liturgy constitution concedes the use of the vernacular in the divine office to some." End quote. It goes on, however, to give more instructions on the use of the Latin in the vernacular, stating, quote, "According to the Constitution on the liturgy, the use of the Latin language with due respect to particular law is to be preserved in the Latin rites. However, since the use of the vernacular may frequently be of great advantage to the people, it is for the competent territorial ecclesiastical authority to decide whether and to what extent the vernacular language is to be used. Its decrees have to be approved, that is, confirmed by the Apostolic See. In observing these norms exactly, one will therefore employ that form of participation which best matches the capabilities of each congregation. Pastors of souls should take care that, beside the vernacular, the faithful may be able to say or sing together in Latin those parts of the ordinary of the Mass which pertain to them. Where the vernacular has been introduced into the celebration of the Mass, the local ordinaries will judge whether it may be opportune to preserve one or more Masses celebrated in Latin, especially sung Masses, in certain churches, above all in large cities, where many come together with faithful of different languages." End quote. Concretely, the prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship under Benedict XVI, Cardinal Arzine, wrote in an address published by the CDW on the Vatican website, quote, "We should do our best to appreciate the language which the Church uses in her liturgy, and to join our hearts and voices to them, according as each liturgical rite may indicate. All of us cannot be Latin speakers, but the lay faithful can at least learn the simpler responses in Latin. Priests should give more attention to Latin, so that they celebrate Mass in Latin occasionally. In big churches, where there are many Masses celebrated on a Sunday or feast day, why can one of these Masses not be in Latin? In rural parishes, a Latin Mass should be possible, say, once a month." End quote. Thus, for example, when considering basilicas, it was ordered that, quote, "In any basilica, as appropriate, especially on feast days, one or two Masses, whether said or sung, are to be celebrated in the Latin language. In such sung Masses, Gregorian chant or sacred polyphony should be rendered with special care and diligence." End quote. Here, we see that the use of the Latin language, far from being replaced, was something that was considered normative, and that vernacular was only added as a concession to particular pastoral needs in certain cases. This same restrained approach was followed 2 months later from the document Tres Abinc Annos from the Sacred Congregation of Rites. Finally, in 1969, the Apostolic Constitution Missale Romanum was promulgated by St. Paul VI, which established the Novus Ordo Missae. Here, the Latin version of the Novus Ordo was said to be the Editio Typica, which meant that the Bishops' Conference, who decided to also promulgate vernacular translations, were required to completely conform to this missal. as will be noted more at length when we discuss the 1983 Code of Canon Law. This is a universal promulgation of the Latin version of the Novus Ordo by the Apostolic See. Bishops' conferences or local bishops cannot unpromulgate this missal. They can only, with permission of the Apostolic See, provide a vernacular translation of this. Thus, both versions remain valid and legal to use for everyone. In the general instructions for the Roman Missal, Latin is encouraged, as we saw before. Thus it states, quote, "Since the faithful from different countries come together ever more frequently, it is desirable that they know how to sing together at least some parts of the ordinary of the Mass in Latin, especially the profession of faith and the Lord's Prayer, according to the simpler settings." End quote. In September of 1970, the Sacred Congregation gave its third instruction on the implementation of the reforms of the liturgy, and in 1971, there was a last warning on the implementation of the new Missal. In it, it is stated, quote, "Regarding the use of language, for Masses with the people, Episcopal conferences have the right to decide on the use of the vernacular in any part of the Mass. Local ordinaries, keeping the good of the faithful especially in mind, should consider whether, in places where vernacular usage has been introduced, it is advisable to celebrate one or more Masses in Latin in certain churches, especially where the faithful of different languages gather more frequently, particularly with singing. In Masses celebrated in Latin, it is appropriate to deliver the readings from sacred scripture and the universal prayer in a vernacular translation, taking into account the linguistic diversity of the participants. In Masses without the people, any priest may use either Latin or the vernacular." End quote. Yet these are all legislative documents. Was there any pastoral guidance during this time about Latin in the liturgy? Yes, there was. St. Paul VI frequently exhorted the use of Latin in the liturgy, and lamented the fact that its use was disappearing. In 1966, St. Paul VI wrote Sacrificium Laudis to religious superiors. He wrote, quote, "While some of your communities are very faithful to the Latin language, others wish to use the vernacular within the choral office. Indeed, some even insist that Latin should be wholly suppressed. We must acknowledge that we have been somewhat disturbed and saddened by these requests. One may well wonder what the origin is of this new way of thinking and this sudden dislike for the past. One may well wonder why these things have been fostered." End quote. He goes on to write, quote, "What is in question here is not only the retention within the choral office of the Latin language, though it is of course right that this should be eagerly guarded, and should certainly not be lightly esteemed. For this language is, within the Latin Church, an abundant wellspring of Christian civilization and a very rich treasure trove of devotion. Of course, the Latin language presents some difficulties, and perhaps not inconsiderable ones, for the new recruits to your holy ranks. But such difficulties, as you know, should not be reckoned insuperable. This is especially true for you, who can more easily give yourselves to study, being more set apart from the business and bother of the world. Moreover, those prayers, with their antiquity, their excellence, their noble majesty, will continue to draw to you young men and women called to the inheritance of our Lord. On the other hand, that choir from which is removed this language of wondrous spiritual power, transcending the boundaries of the nations, and from which is removed this melody proceeding from the inmost sanctuary of the soul, where faith dwells and charity burns, we speak of Gregorian chant. Such a choir will be like a snuffed candle, which gives light no more attracts the eyes and minds of men." End quote. These instructions, of course, apply to religious, but the principle is universal. Simply because there were permissions given to introduce the vernacular in particular cases, and for just reasons, does not mean that there ought to be an entire collapse of the tradition. This is something he took occasion to comment on in his general audience of November 26, 1969, in preparation for the Novus Ordo Missae. He stated, quote, "The introduction of the vernacular will certainly be a great sacrifice for those who know the beauty, the power, and the expressive sacrality of Latin. But in any case, the new rite of the Mass provides that the faithful should be able to sing together in Latin at least the parts of the ordinary of the Mass, especially the Creed and the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father." End quote. Further, in a discourse given in April of 1968, St. Paul VI, after exhorting the learning of Latin for theological and liturgical purposes by seminarians, stated that he wished to defeat a twofold error, writing, quote, "Indeed, it is clear, and we wish to say this openly to those who, through a certain careless impulsiveness or thoughtless desire for novelty, think that the Church ought now to completely abandon the Latin language. It is clear, we say, that this language ought to be held in the highest honor for the excellent and weighty reasons we have mentioned. Nevertheless, it must also be clearly remembered, and we say this to those who, being excessive lovers of antiquity out of some vain pursuit of beauty, or opposed by prejudices to anything new, have sharply criticized recent changes, that the Latin language must serve the pastoral care of souls, not itself. Therefore, in defending the rights that this language has acquired into the Church, one must be especially careful not to impose obstacles or restraints on the renewal of pastoral work that the Fathers of the Second Vatican Council have entrusted to us. For in this area as well, the supreme law must be the salvation of souls." End quote. In the next year, St. Paul VI, in the apostolic letter Antiquae Nobilitatis, wrote, quote, "Continue then, according to the norms of the Second Vatican Ecumenical Council, to use your native languages and sacred rites, along with Latin and ecclesiastical chant, which must be maintained in strict fidelity as their closest companion." End quote. Throughout the early 70s, this was something emphasized time and time again by St. Paul VI. In an audience on August 22, 1973, he gave his 10 commandments for prayer, the 10th of which encouraged that all laymen learn various different chants in Latin. He stated, quote, "A new era is dawning for sacred music. Many ask that the Latin Gregorian chants of the Gloria, Credo, Sanctus, and Agnus Dei be preserved across all nations. May God grant it so. We can restudy how to do this." End quote. This is repeated later that year in an address given on October 12, 1973. Quote, "The faithful must also be formed to establish a link between worship and a musical expression appropriate to it, especially concerning liturgical chant. Praise is likewise due to those who seek to maintain in the common repertoires of liturgical song at least some of the universally used formulas in Latin and Gregorian chant. These are entirely suitable for enabling communal singing, even among the faithful of different nations, at privileged moments in Catholic worship, such as, for example, the Gloria, the Credo, and the Sanctus of the Mass." End quote. All of this took practical form in 1974, when the Congregation of Divine Worship made what was called the minimum repertoire of plain chant, or Jubilate Deo. This was a concrete action to help ensure that all laymen could chant certain parts of the Mass in Latin. It stated, quote, "Our congregation has prepared a booklet entitled Jubilate Deo, which contains a minimum selection of sacred chants. This was done in response to the desire which the Holy Father had frequently expressed, that all the faithful should know at least some Latin Gregorian chants, such as, for example, the Gloria, the Credo, the Sanctus, and the Agnus Dei. It gives me great pleasure to send you a copy of it as a personal gift from His Holiness Pope Paul VI. May I take this opportunity of recommending to your pastoral solicitude this new initiative, whose purpose is to facilitate the observance of the recommendation of the Second Vatican Council. Steps must be taken to ensure that the faithful are able to chant together in Latin those parts of the ordinary Mass which pertain to them. The liturgical reform does not, and indeed cannot, deny the past. Rather does it preserve and foster it with the greatest care. It cultivates and transmits all that is in it of high religious, cultural, and artistic worth, and especially those elements which can express even externally the unity of believers, that is, Latin language. This minimum repertoire of Gregorian chant has been prepared with that purpose in mind, to make it easier for Christians to achieve unity and spiritual harmony with their brothers and with the living traditions of the past. Hence it is that those who are trying to improve the quality of congregational singing cannot refuse to Gregorian chant the place which is due to it." End quote. During these last years of the life of St. Paul VI, despite his constant exhortations, he saw a church in crisis, a church in rebellion both to his authority and the authority of tradition. Despite his constant exhortations, he was constantly ignored. In 1978, St. Paul VI died and was replaced by Blessed John Paul I, who would quickly be replaced by St. John Paul II. Yet, before we get into his pontificate in particular, it is important to look at a document which had been formulated behind the scenes during this time, the Code of Canon Law. Canon 928 of the Code of Canon Law states, quote, "The Eucharistic celebration is to be carried out in the Latin language, or in any other language provided that the liturgical texts have been legitimately approved." End quote. In commenting on this text, Cardinal Arzine, prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship from 2002 to 2008, stated that, quote, "Those who want to give the impression that the Church has put Latin away from her liturgy are mistaken." End quote. Here the law states that there are two ways in which the universal law of the Church allows a priest to celebrate Mass, either in the vernacular approved by his Episcopal Conference, or in the Latin text that has been approved for the universal Church, which is called the Editio Typica. By constituting the Latin text of the Novus Ordo as the Editio Typica, the Church grants the right to its celebration universally in the Latin rite. It is the text of the vernacular translations that require permissions from the Holy See to be promulgated and added alongside the Editio Typica. Thus, for example, when Pope Francis in Traditionis Custodes said, quote, "The liturgical books promulgated by St. Paul VI and St. John Paul II, in conformity with the decrees of the Vatican Council II, are the unique expression of the lex orandi of the Roman Rite," end quote, the missal that is being referred to is the Editio Typica, that is, the Latin Novus Ordo. Yet, as we know, there is a certain public nature to certain celebrations of the Eucharist, those celebrations which are done for the sake of the lay faithful who are present. In these cases, obviously, the bishop can require the use of the vernacular missal, yet otherwise it does not fall under the bishop's competence to restrict, since the right has been given by a higher authority, that is, the Apostolic See. Thus, the Congregation for Divine Worship in Redemptionis Sacramentum explained this canon, writing, quote, "Mass is celebrated either in Latin or in another language, provided that liturgical texts are used which have been approved according to the norm of law. Except in the case of celebrations of the Mass that are scheduled by the ecclesiastical authorities to take place in the language of the people, priests are always and everywhere permitted to celebrate the Mass in Latin," end quote. Thus, when discussing the use of other languages in the vernacular celebrations of the Novus Ordo, the CDW was careful to clarify in their instruction Liturgiam Authenticam that, quote, "it is always possible to use the Latin language," end quote. Yet there is also a second situation that helps highlight another time where Latin is legally permitted in the Roman Rite to any priest. Yet this permission is something that is both private and public. Liturgiam Authenticam, in instructing translators of the liturgical books, writes, quote, "Consideration should also be given to including in the vernacular editions at least some texts in the Latin language, especially those from the priceless treasury of Gregorian chant, which the Church recognizes as proper to the Roman liturgy, and which, all other things being equal, is to be given pride of place in liturgical celebrations," end quote. Following this instruction, many Episcopal conferences have included both the vernacular and Latin text for certain prayers that the Church has encouraged the faithful to know. Thus, if a priest were to use the Latin of these prayers in the liturgy, he would still be drawing from the vernacular missal, and completely within his rights to use these at any time and in any place he pleases. It is outside of the scope of the executive powers of the bishop to restrict a priest on this point. Now that we have that out of the way, we can move on to considering properly what was said by St. John Paul II on the use of Latin in the liturgy. The most important document on this was a letter sent early in his pontificate in the year 1980, where he encouraged the maximal use of Latin that is possible in each circumstance. He wrote, quote, "Nevertheless, there are also those people who, having been educated on the basis of the old liturgy in Latin, experience the lack of this one language, which in all the world was an expression of the unity of the Church, and through its dignified character elicited a profound sense of the Eucharistic mystery. It is therefore necessary to show not only understanding, but also full respect towards these sentiments and desires. As far as possible, these sentiments and desires are to be accommodated, as is moreover provided for in the new dispositions. The Roman Church has special obligations towards Latin, the splendid language of ancient Rome, and she must manifest them whenever the occasion presents itself," end quote. In 1988, on the 25th anniversary of the document Sacrosanctum Concilium, St. John Paul II restates this and refutes false readings of Vatican II on the vernacular in the liturgy, writing, quote, "Given that the liturgy is the school of the prayer of the Church, it has been considered good to introduce and develop the use of the vernacular, without diminishing the use of Latin, retained by the Council for the Latin Rite, so that every individual can understand and proclaim in his or her mother tongue the wonders of God," end quote. In 1998, St. John Paul II gave one of the best justifications for the use of Latin in the liturgy, and a move away from a pure vernacularism. In speaking to the U.S. bishops, he said, quote, "Conscious participation calls for the entire community to be properly instructed in the mysteries of the liturgy, lest the experience of worship denigrate into a form of ritualism. But it does not mean a constant attempt within the liturgy itself to make the implicit explicit, since this often leads to a verbosity and informality which are alien to the Roman Rite and end by trivializing the act of worship. Nor does it mean the suppression of all subconscious experience, which is vital in a liturgy which thrives on symbols that speaks to the subconscious just as they speak to the conscious. The use of the vernacular has certainly opened up the treasuries of the liturgy to all who take part, But this does not mean that the Latin language, and especially the chants which are so superbly adapted to the genius of the Roman Rite, should be wholly abandoned. If subconscious experience is ignored in worship, an effective and devotional vacuum is created, and the liturgy can become not only too verbal, but also too cerebral. Yet the Roman Rite is again distinctive in the balance it strikes between a spareness and a richness of emotion. It feeds the heart and the mind, the body and the soul." End quote. Further, in 2003, much like St. Paul VI did, St. John Paul II sent a chirograph encouraging the use of Latin Gregorian chant to all the bishops of the world. After St. John Paul II, we obviously have the pontificate of Benedict XVI, which was quite full of references to the Latin language, especially in the liturgy. The most important and most authoritative of these is Benedict XVI's Sacramentum Caritatis, which dedicates a portion of the text to the use of the Latin language in the liturgy. It states, quote, "I wish to endorse the proposal made by the Synod of Bishops, in harmony with the directives of the Second Vatican Council, that, with the exception of the readings, the homily, and the prayer of the faithful, it is fitting that large concelebrations be celebrated in Latin. Similarly, the better-known prayers of the Church's tradition should be recited in Latin, and, if possible, selections of Gregorian chant should be sung. Speaking more generally, I ask that future priests, from the time in the seminary, receive the preparation needed to understand and to celebrate Mass in Latin, and also to use Latin texts and execute Gregorian chant. Nor should we forget that the faithful can be taught to recite the more common prayers in Latin, and also to sing parts of the liturgy to Gregorian chant." End quote. This emphasis on catechesis that directs the faithful towards the memorization of Latin prayers for the liturgy is something that was already emphasized in the composition of the Compendium of the Catechism by Benedict XVI. He made a special note that, quote, "The text includes an appendix at the end, which consists of several common prayers for the universal Church and several catechetical formulas of the Catholic faith. The appropriate decision to add several prayers to conclude the compendium is an invitation to rediscover a common way of praying in the Church, not only personally but also in community. In each one of the translations, the majority of the prayers will also be presented in Latin. Learning them, even in this language, will make it easier for the Christian faithful who speak different languages to pray together, especially when they meet for special circumstances. As I said in 1997, on the occasion of the presentation of my venerable predecessor of the typical edition in Latin of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, quote, "Precisely in the multiplicity of languages and cultures, Latin, for so many centuries the vehicle and instrument of Christian culture, not only guarantees continuity with our roots, but also continues to be as relevant as ever for strengthening the bonds of unity of the faith and the communion of the Church." End quote. Further, it was under Benedict's reign that the head of the CDW, Cardinal Arzin, gave an address titled Language in the Latin Rite Liturgy, Latin and Vernacular, which has been quoted multiple times above and gives a great overview of the topic of this video in its historical and theological aspects. Lastly, since we do not have much from Pope Leo, despite many indications of his favorability towards Latin, we have Pope Francis. One of the most significant texts related to this topic from the pontificate of Pope Francis was the major change in canon law that he made when it came to the task of the episcopal conferences in making translations into the vernacular. Within this document, he states, quote, "The Latin Church was aware of the attendant sacrifice involved in the partial loss of liturgical Latin, which has been in use throughout the world over the course of centuries. However, it willingly opened the door so that these versions, as part of the rites themselves, might become the voice of the Church celebrating the divine mysteries along with the Latin language." End quote. It is important to note that Pope Francis is careful at how he describes the history. It is not a complete loss of liturgical Latin, but partial. Further, it is not that the vernacular would be used, but that the vernacular would be used alongside the Latin language. Unlike previous popes, there is not much from Pope Francis on the Latin language in the liturgy per se, only statements about the 1962 Missal, which most are already aware of. Now, it is important to recall that it is not only the Holy See which gives such directives, but also the Episcopal Conference of the United States, known as the USCCB. In 1972, the Bishops' Committee on the Liturgy, which was the precursor to the current Committee on Divine Worship, wrote a guide to music in the liturgy called Music in Catholic Worship. In this document, the general assumption is the use of the vernacular, with no special mention of the preservation of Latin in the liturgy. A decade later, another document called Liturgical Music Today, issued in 1982, spoke of the collapse of much of the preconciliar liturgical tradition and gave some advice of how to recover some of the tradition, especially by the use of St. Paul VI's Jubilate Deo mentioned above. Yet the most significant instruction would not come until 2007, with the USCCB document called Sing to the Lord. It gives one of the best practical summaries of the instructions of the Church thus far. It states, quote, "The use of the vernacular is the norm in most liturgical celebrations in the dioceses of the United States, for the sake of a better comprehension of the mystery being celebrated. However, care should be taken to foster the role of Latin in the liturgy, particularly in liturgical song. Pastors should ensure that the faithful may also be able to say or to sing together in Latin those parts of the ordinary of the Mass which pertain to them. They should be able to sing these parts of the Mass proper to them, at least according to the simpler melodies. At international and multicultural gatherings of different language groups, it is most appropriate to celebrate the liturgy in Latin, with the exception of the readings, the homily, and the prayer of the faithful. In addition, selections of Gregorian chant should be sung at such gatherings whenever possible. To the greatest extent possible and applicable, singers and choir directors are encouraged to deepen their familiarity with the Latin language. Whenever the Latin language poses an obstacle to singers, even after sufficient training has been provided, for example in pronunciation, understanding of the text, or confident rendition of a piece, it would be more prudent to employ vernacular language in the liturgy. Seminarians should receive the preparation needed to understand and to celebrate Mass in Latin, and also to use Latin texts and execute Gregorian chant. In promoting the use of Latin in the liturgy, pastors should always employ that form of participation which best matches the capabilities of each congregation. The Second Vatican Council directed that the faithful should be able to sing parts of the ordinary of the Mass together in Latin. In many worshiping communities in the United States, fulfilling this directive will mean introducing Latin chants to worshipers who perhaps have not sung it before. While prudence, pastoral sensitivity, and reasonable time for progress are encouraged to achieve this end, every effort in this regard is laudable and highly encouraged." End quote. In the teaching of the USCCB, this becomes especially important for situations where there are individuals who speak multiple languages at the same Mass. Thus, in the document titled Guidelines for a Multilingual Celebration of Mass, reflecting the general instructions of the Roman Missal, it states, quote, "When Latin chants or antiphons are known, understood, and can be sung well, these can be an effective means for bringing about musical unity." End quote. As we have seen, there has been a consistent message that the Church has given as to Latin in the liturgy for the last 60 years. It is completely false that the Church discourages or even prohibits the use of Latin in the liturgy. To the contrary, the Church has consistently encouraged the use of the Latin language when celebrating the Novus Ordo.